Hi, how are you? This is Tom Meyers, Executive Director of the Fort Lee Film Commission and the Barrymore Film Center. This is the second of our semi-regular films that we're going to show to you, public domain films, which may or may not have a connection to Fort Lee. While we're going through this virus situation, we want to keep our social media at the Barrymore Film Center alive, let you know what's coming as we open later this year. Once we get past this virus, our construction is continuing as we speak. Construction was not closed. Governor Murphy didn't close construction, so that's good news amidst a lot of sketchy news. So our construction is still going on, and we're very careful about the site up there, as the borough is, so everything is going very well there. But what are we doing now today? Yesterday we screened for you a great film, Universal's first horror film that was shot in Fort Lee, called Dr. Jekyll, and today we're doing something a little different. As I tape this on March 24th, this is actually the birthday of a great American comedian who was very influential in, of all careers, Charles Chaplin's, and that's Roscoe Arbuckle. Some of you, if you know him at all, may know him as Fatty Arbuckle. He hated the name Fatty. We always call him Roscoe. Love Roscoe. And the film we're going to show you today is something very interesting, shot on the streets of Fort Lee at both Palisades Amusement Park and outside the studio walls of Triangle Fox Studio on Linwood Avenue and Main Street in 1916. The film A Reckless Romeo was shot in the summer of 1916, not released until 1917, and there's an interesting story about that. But how did Arbuckle come to Fort Lee? Well, one of the first filmmakers to shoot in Fort Lee was D.W. Griffith from 1908 to 1912, did much of his location work, not all of it, but much of it in Fort Lee for Biograph. And from 1909 to 1912, Max Sennett worked for Griffith as an actor, and we think probably somewhat of a comedy director. And Sennett's most famous film for Biograph and for D.W. Griffith was The Curtain Pole, shot in 1909 up and down Main Street in Fort Lee, one of the first American slapstick comedies. In 1911, D.W. Griffith hired a young actress who was making films in Brooklyn, Mabel Normand, brought her to Fort Lee. This is where Mac met Mabel, Max Sennett, Mabel Normand. A wonderful and tragic romance would follow them from Fort Lee to California and back again. And the creation of Keystone Studios, born in the summer of 1912, when both Sennett and Mabel Normand broke from Griffith and formed their own studio. And they shot films, the first Keystone films in Fort Lee, the summer of 1912. They didn't physically have a studio, so they did all exterior shooting. The best example that survives is a film from 1912 called The Grocery Clerk's Romance. That film was found and were restored by a great film historian and a preservationist, great friend of ours from Michigan, Paul Garucki. Paul allowed us to use a very rough cut of that film before he restored it when we were trying to save, about 4 or 5 years ago, the Rambo house, the old Rambo saloon on First Street, which was threatened with destruction. And the entire film of Grocery Clerk's Romance was shot outside that building. So in combination with that film, thanks to Paul Garucki, the book by Arthur C. Miller, a cameraman who was from Fort Lee in terms of working here, and the leadership of Mayor Sockledge and the council, we were able to save that building, Rambo's. Now there's a big marker outside, and it's a beautiful building. Where does Arbuckle come into this? Well, Max Sennett, Mabel Normand then left the fall of 1912 to California, where they did physically have a Keystone studio. And a few years later, not only did Charlie Chaplin become a part of their team, but so did Roscoe Arbuckle. Now, 1916 comes, Mabel Normand and Max Sennett had a big problem with their relationship. We won't get into that here, but as a result, Max sent a whole troupe to follow Mabel to Fort Lee, where he leased space via Triangle Studio and part of the Fox Studio on Linwood Avenue and Main Street. And Sennett stayed in California, but he sent Arbuckle and a troupe to go with Mabel and create films for Keystone. And Arbuckle did. And this was probably one of the most creative periods of Arbuckle's career, because Arbuckle didn't have Max Sennett breathing down his neck. He could be creative in front of the camera and behind the camera, because Arbuckle directed a lot of these films. One of the great films he directed with Mabel Normand, starring in it, and him starring in it as well, was He Did and He Didn't, which is a brilliant dark comedy. The film we're here about today is called, from 1917, produced in the summer of 1916, and that's A Reckless Romeo. And Reckless Romeo is a brilliant little film. The locations are worth the price of admission. They shot at Palisades Amusement Park, which was operated by two brothers, Joe and Nick Skank. They bought the park in 1910, operated through 1935, and they were also filmmakers. And then other portions of the film were shot on Main Street near Linwood Avenue, outside the studio walls, outside the walls of Holy Angels, and you could see the trolley coming down Main Street, and you could see one scene, a police officer running from Main Street up Anderson Avenue. So just from a Fort Lee perspective, this footage, over 100 years old, is brilliant, but the film itself is a classic comedy. You would see this template be used by every other comedian that followed Arbuckle. I mean, you look at Oliver Hardy, you look at Lou Costello, you even look at Jackie Gleason, and you could see elements of Arbuckle in their performances. And specifically, Lou Costello was a kid when this came out. He was about 10 or 11 years old, so I'm sure he saw it, and I'm sure Arbuckle influenced his performance as an adult great comedian. So we're going to take a look at this film. The only thing I would add is, while in Fort Lee, filming at Palisades Amusement Park, Joe Skank started his own studio in New York City in that same period of time, and he scooped Arbuckle away from Senate. So Arbuckle essentially took this Keystone film, and it became a Comique film released by Paramount in 1917, and he began to work with Joe Skank and not Max Sennett, because Max Sennett, great filmmaker, but not the most generous boss, so the Skanks made a better deal to Arbuckle, and he took it. And Arbuckle would work out of the Skank studio in New York and in Fort Lee, and he would introduce a young comedian named Buster Keaton into life before the cameras. And Keaton's first films were shot in New York and Fort Lee. So that's a very cool thing to have in terms of our own history on the East Coast. So this film, again, was released in 1917. It's a very, very funny film. I hope you enjoy it. And I'm taping this on what would be Roscoe Arbuckle's birthday. So wherever you are, Roscoe, I hope you have a very happy birthday, and thank you for leaving us a legacy of great films. So let's sit back and watch A Reckless Romeo.
pinches my butter. They won't leave my butter alone. And nothing is better than butter for keeping the old man at home. Everybody says I'm old-fashioned to sit on the things that are rationed. So pinch all my ham and my plum and apple jam, but please leave my butter alone.